Further questions? Don't see any. Thank you, Fred. Dakota Moore. Welcome to State Affairs. Welcome
Thank
back.
you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, my name is Dakota Moore. I'm here today on behalf of the National Rifle Association. I hope y'all saved some questions for me. I was getting a little antsy when Senator McKenzie was getting peppered. Excuse me. As I said in the Senate State Affairs Committee, I think that the simplicity of this language and the changes in 1389 really betrays how much effort went into it, the contemplation, this consideration, and the meticulous nature in which this language was drafted. I guess I'll begin my testimony by going over a few of the questions that were asked earlier with regard to Representative Luker's question and the inclusion of the disqualifying language in there. That actually was placed in there to incorporate a very specific subset of non-firearm deadly weapons. Now, with the without that concealed carry disqualifier inclusion, what would happen was the firearm disqualifiers under both state and federal law would be applicable to prevent the unlawful possession of firearms outside city limits. However, neither state nor federal law outside that list of disqualifiers applies to concealed deadly weapons. So knives, stuff of that ilk, that's why it was placed in there, just to capture all concealed deadly weapons for consistency purposes. Firearms was never an issue because obviously state and federal law would control that possession. With regard to Representative Wintrow's questions earlier, I think you're absolutely correct in the fact that that you pointed out the three changes in the law, which would be putatively or prima facie on its face that it eliminates the education requirement, the background check requirement, and the permitting system in general, the fees that are associated with that. With regard to the training requirement, I think it has been noted that under existing law, there is no requirement to show or display to the sheriff that you actually have an aptitude or have knowledge of firearm safety. The sheriff may require, and that subsequent list of things that he must accept as examples of that. For instance, the hunter's education class, they don't require any actual firearm training, live firing of firearms. For most hunter education classes, that would obviously have to be accepted. I think everybody can appreciate in this room that Idaho is a rurally situated state where hunting and use of firearms and that type of heritage is ubiquitous, is pervasive throughout the state. A formal training, while always encouraged, I believe that in many instances we learn to shoot from our parents and friends, other individuals. We have that training. Not only that, what we see, and it's universal actually, studies done in all but one state. Alaska is the outlier here, but following passage of permitless carry, permit requests, applications have actually risen. And it makes sense if you think about it. Individuals get used to, they can avail themselves of this new opportunity, the opportunity to carry now without having to obtain a permit. And they often want to take advantage of reciprocity, the reciprocal benefits associated with that permit. And once they learn more about, the responsibility of carrying a concealed weapon on their person, most of them want to seek that training. We actually have seen an increase in training associated with that. With regard to the background check issue, I do want to point out that, as has been stated, federal law requires that every time you purchase a firearm from a gun dealer, that you must undergo a background check. Furthermore, with the list of disqualifiers on page 2, line 22 through 23, included in there, we ensure that an individual who had been disqualified on the front end from obtaining a permit is actually disqualified on the back end. So what I consider is an inversion of the permitting process. I believe Representative Wintrow stated out earlier that that law enforcement loses the presumption that you're actually breaking the law. That is actually not the case in the way that this language was drafted. Now, because, and we stated earlier about how Idaho doesn't have very many disqualifiers for non-firearm concealed weapons. So what we had to do, and to ensure that only law-abiding individuals were able to avail themselves of this, was actually include that list. But we set it up as an exemption to the statute itself, which says, "No person shall carry concealed weapons on or about his person without a license to carry concealed weapons, except." So if you are carrying a concealed weapon without a license to carry a concealed weapon, pursuant to subsection 3 of 3302, you are breaking the law. It is the impetus, or the onus is on you to therefore show that you meet one of the exceptions. Now, it should be a fairly simple process of showing that you meet the exception for over the age of 21, a resident of Idaho, and not otherwise prohibited. And I think that is made even simpler now with the technology that our law enforcement currently has access to, which allows them to access state databases and national databases to be able to confirm or ascertain whether this individual would be disqualified. I think it was stated last Monday in the Senate State Affairs Committee that law enforcement would actually have to aver a clear investigatory purpose in order to access that database. That actually is correct, but because the way that subsection 3 reads, they have a clear investigatory purpose, and that would be suspicion of carrying a concealed weapon contrary to state law. So I don't believe that those three issues are actual legitimate concerns, which brings me to the point that is addressed, I believe, in the handout that you should have all received, and that is, I did a frequently asked questions list regarding permitless carry. It should look like this right here. And because I do not believe that there are any existing public safety concerns regarding this legislation. As a matter of fact, I believe this legislation is consistent with existing law. And I do want to point out real quick that everybody has stated that we've had a concealed weapons licensing statute that's worked for over 100 years. I believe some of you in this room might remember in 1990 when we actually changed that licensing process to a shall issue process. Previous to that, for the first 81 years of Idaho's concealed weapon licensing process, it was a may issue process and would only be available to individuals who were buddies with the sheriff, who is in charge of actually, if you had a sheriff who exercised extreme discretion in issuing those permits. The same rhetoric was used during that time. Actually, I've gone back and reviewed records and that was associated with it, especially last year, and the same rhetoric was used about public safety. And subsequently, we haven't had these public safety issues associated with that. It's consistent with existing law. Open carry is legal. Concealed carry outside the city limits are legal. Let's bring that together, and let's allow Idahoans to exercise those rights without having to pay taxes to the government, without having to ask that permission, but only law-abiding Idahoans. Real briefly, I'll run through this list of frequently asked questions. I think most of them have been addressed. In case y'all are wondering, Idaho would be the 8th, some refer to it as the 9th state to enact permitless carry if this were to go through. Vermont, Alaska, Arizona, Wyoming, Kansas, and Maine have all previously enacted it. We do have studies from the states, the first 4 states, because there has been the time lapse since enactment that has allowed us to collect data. We have not seen any increase in violent crime in any of these states. As a matter of fact, it is decreased consistent with the national average. West Virginia passed it this year. That law will go into effect on June 5th, 2016. Furthermore, we were talking about the vehicle earlier. There are 25 states in the United States that currently allow law-abiding individuals to possess a concealed loaded handgun in their vehicle without a permit. So that would actually be a change that Idaho would be making that is consistent with a majority of states, and that does not include West Virginia as well. So if Idaho were to enact this, there'd be 26 states that would allow that. Law enforcement that has been covered, the Sheriff's Association and the Fraternal Order of Police, have both come out in support of this legislation, believing that law-abiding individuals are their allies in keeping Idahoans safe. An increase in firearm accidents for misuse, I don't want to belabor the point, but obviously training is always encouraged. However, that government-mandated minimum training, we've done studies on this. We've looked at other states. Government-mandated minimum training to obtain a concealed weapon permit There is no direct correlation or correlation at all in that and incidents of firearm accidents and misuse. We've gone over this. You can already open carry without a permit or training, and no training is mandated. No specific handgun training is mandated to obtain a regular license, a standard license. It does not eliminate Idaho's current licensing process. The current licensing processes that Idaho maintains are retained. They are left fully intact. Individuals will still be able to avail themselves of the benefits of attaining a license. Reciprocity, NICS exemption, those are real benefits. I know a lot of Idahoans appreciate that, and that is retained in this legislation. And as was stated earlier, this has no effect on these schools. This has no effect on who can carry on college and university campuses. That's still restricted to individuals carrying pursuant to 183302K, the enhanced license. The one question that I believe it was you, Representative Nielsen, had is that there is, on the last page, if you turn to page 8, and I believe it was you, Representative, that inquired as to school teachers. As Chairman McKenzie correctly stated, that the controlling section on that is 183302D4F. Now, it is confusing because we have an 183302-4F reference in here, but if you look right below that is where you see the reference to 183302D, and it's in subsection 1, not the initial clause. But with regard to the school teachers, subsection C is lifted exactly from 183302D, and if that school teacher had authorization from the governing authority, then legally speaking, they would not be breaking the law and carrying in the school. If they had that authority, that's been existing law. That's been in 3302D ever since I can remember. With that, Mr. Chairman, I believe I've covered everything that's been addressed, worth covering. I will stand for questions, and I appreciate the time.
Are there questions? Representative Nielsen?
Thank you. In reference to the school and that authorizing authority, can that be the principal of the school?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Nielsen, I believe it says any person who's authorized to carry a weapon by person, board, or other entity having authority. In the case of schools, I would imagine it's probably a board. I do not have the specifics on that. I do think 3302D does provide greater insight into that. I just wanted to draw that correlation for you, absent us having 3302D in front of us at this moment.
Thank you.
Representative Bateman?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Dakota, you indicated that studies indicate that
Pull your microphone down, would you, so we can hear you?
the states that have enacted concealed handgun without a government-issued permit, allowing that, Vermont, Alaska, Arizona, Wyoming, Kansas, and Maine, you've indicated that the studies indicate there's been no increase in crime in those states. Well, critical to me on this whole question is what do the studies say about accident rates in those states? Of accident rates with firearms increased in those states, and that's the question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bateman, I believe I addressed those two separately. So first, you are absolutely correct. I did state that in those states, in the states where we have data that is sufficient to actually accumulate, there has been no evidence that violent crime, as I stated earlier, has increased. Now, with regard to accident rates, I believe we specifically addressed that on page 2 of this handout that you should have. And that is addressed specifically to accident rates. There is no direct correlation between government-mandated training and firearm accidents, an increase in firearm accidents. And I think I do need to clarify that there are many states that do not require training in order to obtain a permit at all. And so we actually have a breadth of data associated with that, showing no direct correlation between whether the state has government-mandated training in order to obtain a concealed weapon and accidents that occur in that state. It's all over the map. That's why we actually I can't even give you a correct response. And I think that makes sense because the way that we collect data on this issue is through the CDC, and they don't, I guess, dissect the type of accidents that are occurring, whether the individual had a concealed weapons permit, whether the accident was a hunting accident, not even with a handgun, whether it's a long gun, handgun, or not. And so all I can say is there's no direct correlation between government mandated training for concealed weapons license and firearm accidents.
Follow up.
Representative Bateman.
Representative Dakota. So what you're telling me, we really have no statistics on accident rates that, in these states that have, aside from training, you say that if there's no correlation between states with, or that if they don't have training, what I'm confused here. I'm sorry. So there's no indication that there's more accidents in these states, is what you're telling me.
Mr. Chairman?
No proof that there's an increase in accidents.
Mr. Chairman, that's what I'm telling you. I probably, it was in a long-winded manner, yes, sir, but that's
Okay.
what I'm telling you.
He took the scenic route to get
Yes,
there.
I took the scenic route to get there.
Further questions? Seeing none? Oh, Representative Wintrow. Surprise, surprise.